Hello, class, and welcome to week 4 of cognitive psychology. This time has really flown by. I can't believe we're in week 4, but we are here. This lecture video will serve the purpose as to reviewing your week 4 module activities. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So for this week, I know during last week we talked a little bit about short-term memory and things like that. So this week we'll focus more on long-term memory and retrieval errors. And specifically for this lecture video, I'll probably focus more on memory errors. So just be mindful of that whenever you are reading through the text, that I will be focusing on memory errors more. So spending a little bit more time on that chapter 6, long-term memory, can definitely be beneficial and helpful. So let's jump right in. We are, of course, on week 4. The agenda for the week will be your reading assignments, as well as watch this lecture video that I'm recording right now. Reading chapters 6 and 7, as well as a couple TED Talks for you. There's a TED Talk on memory athletics, which is quite interesting. And then there's a TED Talk on storage versus retrieval. And lastly, you have 2 additional videos on, I can't remember what this one is about. I think it is, let me see how long it is first. 8 minutes. So it's about 9 minutes. It's basically, I want to say, true or false questions regarding memory. Let's see how long these are. This is 12 minutes, so that's about 20 minutes right there. And 25. So I would say that you have about maybe 30 to 40 minute videos. So like I said, I won't spend too much time on this lecture video. So you do have time to read your chapters as well as review all the lecture or the additional supplemental videos for this week. And then you have this one is on learning from memory errors. So this will be in addition to what I am talking about for this lecture. And then lastly, of course, you'll have your discussion board posts. You don't have any papers or projects due this week, so that's, I believe, quite a bit of relief. I will be reaching out to some of you just to check in. So if you get that email, just look forward to that. So we can see if you are falling behind or if you're doing excellent. You may get an email as well in regards to that. So stay tuned for an email from me. So yeah, the discussion board post, this is pretty much what you guys have been doing. You guys have been doing such a great job on these discussion boards and interacting with your classmates. Also too, I will have your papers graded, I would say no later than Friday. I'm trying to shoot for Thursday, but I will let you guys know. And you'll see that those grades come in hopefully somewhere in between Wednesday, Thursday, and no later than Friday. I will have all your papers graded. So if you have any additional questions, comments, concerns about your grade or your feedback, please feel free to reach out to me so I can assist you so you can address those issues that you may have in your papers and before completing another assignment. So with that being said, let's jump right into the lecture video. And I know I mentioned to you before that I won't be spending too much time on chapter 6, but I just want to show you guys what all you would expect to see in chapter 6 if you have not read the chapter yet. So of course it's on long-term memory and influences on retrieval. It talks about why people often forget. It talks about how you encode and process information and how that differs within long-term memory and short-term memory. You have spacing effects. You also have your encoding and retrieval interactions, so how someone perceives the information and retrieves that information and how that differs. And you also have mnemonics, which is memory techniques that have been used by humans for thousands of years that helps to remember and retain information. And that speaks along the lines of long-term memory. Let's see. So, and here's a few examples of what mnemonics can be. which is, I think this makes it quite easy for you to recall and remember what that means, because it's great memory tools. And I think a lot of teachers use these to, retain and require that information. And specifically, if you're studying for an exam or test, you may use mnemonics to remember the materials for that exam. And super autobiographical memory. So some people have autobiographical memory. If you watched, I want to say Criminal Minds. I think one of the characters has that memory where you can just remember anything. Look at something and you can remember exactly what that says. Or even in The Suit, the one character, Michael Ross, he had that as well. You can look at a piece of paper or document and remember exactly what it said, word for word, with perfect accuracy. So that speaks to, a few people. I want to say it's very rare. Not many people have that or process that ability, but if you do that, I think that's really cool. So yeah, that's enough on chapter 6. So let's jump right into chapter 7. So the focus of chapter 7 would be memory errors. And many of us experience memory errors, whether that's if you're studying for a test and you may forget the material that you studied, or even your family members remember a memory and you don't really quite recall those memories, or even in cases where you're an eyewitness in a case, and we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more. So the case that I was talking about in terms of inaccuracy of memory is the case of Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton. So this case, it happened in 1984. Jennifer was a 22-year-old college student in Burlington, North Carolina. A man happened to break into her home and held her at knife point and raped her. During the attack, Jennifer, she kept her eyes open. She studied her assailant's face and body, trying to memorize every mark, every scar, his height, his approximate weight, the color of his eyes. So she did a very great job of being present in that moment despite what was going on, and studying him just to make sure that whenever the time came that she could identify him. So she, did everything she could to help identify the man and put him away. She eventually, after the attack happened, she went down to the police station that same day, and she picked Ronald Cotton from a photo. And then she picked him out of a lineup. And from this case, she wrongly convicted the wrong man due to her memory recall. So no matter how much studying and visualizing and scanning of the victim or the suspect, she inaccurately picked this person out of the lineup based on what she believed her memory to recall. And I want to speak a little bit about that too. And this talks about, there's I believe ultimately Innocence Project freed him from prison after he was wrongly convicted. However, this happens so much in so many times. So and it's not just from memory error, but it also can be from other instances that may occur. And I know it's sad, but it does happen, and it just speaks to how trauma has an impact on your brain. No matter how hard you study, no matter how hard you remember, the effect of trauma, and sometimes our memory can fail us. So I think it's important that we are doing our due diligence. Not saying she did anything wrong. She did the best that she could in this scenario, in terms of trying to remember. But I also think that other parties should do more due diligence of getting a DNA analysis and things like that. And I know back during this time, this may not have been something that they could do. But thankful that the Innocence Project was able to free him after serving time for something he did not commit. So that's an instance of how our memory can fail us, and memory errors do happen. So the next slide, the 7 sins of memory. Okay, so back speaking on memory errors and memory inaccuracies, many errors aren't only a result of brain damage or disease, like in the instance of Jennifer. Um, her main issue, I believe, don't quote me, but I think it was probably the trauma, processing the trauma, had a major impact on her memory and her recovery of that memory. Um, and also too, the trauma could have affected how she perceived certain information. Um, there are seven senses of memory that are byproducts of the way our memories function and are typical of everyone to different and varying degrees. And they, reveal adaptive mechanisms of our memory, and that differs in each person. So as we move on, here's a little chart to describe um, those seven senses of memory. And the main process of, the main, I want to say, developer or author of this theory of the seven senses of memory was Daniel Schachter. And he perceives, let me zoom in on this, that the seven senses of memory are transient, absent-mindedness, blocking, bias, persistence, as well as, oops, sorry. There's always something going on with these slides whenever I do these for you guys. I'm sorry. As well as suggestibility and source. I cannot see this. I need to zoom in a little bit more. Source misattribution. So we'll talk a little bit more of these seven sins of memory. And if you just think on a few of them, absent-mindedness, of course, it's a lack of attention during encoding of a retrieval. And a lot of people experience absent-mindedness. Transience, and that's normal forgetting over time. Persistence, experiencing an unwanted memory, so a memory that keeps recurring in your mind. Blocking, failure to retrieve that information even when you know the information. So say for instance, this happens a lot. Whenever I wake up, I'm trying to remember a dream. I know this information, I know what happened in that dream, but I just cannot retrieve what that dream was about. So that also speaks to unconscious and conscious memories as well. So bias is the alteration of the memory from current experience or knowledge. So you may have like some preconceived notions about about that memory. I always do this. I never forget. I never remember to exit out those little things at the top. Suggestibility, which is a change in memory from others. Suggestions or statements. So your memory can change based on your family's feedback or things like that. Or source misattribution. So misremembering the source of learned information. And just think about back on, maybe some instances in your life where you've experienced a few of those. So as we mentioned before, I gave you a couple definitions. So let's talk about some examples. So transience. So forgetting, say for instance, if you go on a trip and you parked your car at a car park, and you forget where you parked that car 3 weeks ago. And that's normal forgetting over time. So having some sort of visualization tool to help you remember those things. Absent-mindedness, losing your car keys. I know my father struggles with this so much. We had to buy him one of those little beepy things for his car keys because he always loses them. So absent-mindedness. The next slide, blocking. Having an actor's name on the tip of your tongue. And I talked about this whenever I'm trying to retrieve a memory or a dream. Source misattribution. Thinking your friend told you something when you actually heard it on the news. And I think many of us can be victims of this as well. Specifically in modern day times when social media is such a huge thing. Like a lot of times people are like, where did you hear that from? I'm like, did I hear it from the news or did I hear it from Twitter? But just, I think that's a good one for modern times for sure. Suggestibility. George Bush on 9/11. So lot of the, I don't want to spend too much time on this topic because I think I can talk about this forever. But I think that a lot of the times whenever we think about 9/11, we think about, exactly where we were, what happened, and things like that. And some of you may not be old enough to remember, but a lot of misinformation was out there during this time, and I think that the president he suffered from suggestibility, altering the actual memories or creating false memories for events we experienced on that day. So that's all I want to say on that topic. Bias, of course. Say, for instance, you go through a rough breakup and you're remembering happy times as more negative than they actually were. So considering you're going through a situation and your memories are tainted because of the pain that you're feeling at that current moment. And persistence. So they put the example of PTSD. So a soldier coming back from combat, and I think that's a really great example because it does speak to how the persistence of a memory can affect us. And PTSD is one of those things that is definitely a persistence of memory. So yeah, that's a really good one. So if you think on and using these examples to remember these 7 sins it's useful, and I think that will definitely help in processing the information. So, the reconstructive nature of memory, and I've always said this too before, children specifically are very resilient when it comes to specifically trauma and recollection of memory. But speaking as an adult, we do not all, record and store aspects of our experiences together. We differ in so many ways. We encode and we store the pieces of an experience or information. We also attempt to put the correct pieces back together like they were a puzzle when we're retrieving that memory. Sometimes we forget certain pieces. We tend to automatically replace them with incorrect pieces of our experiences or from our imagination. So this overall speaks to how each person differs in their thought process and their nature and their reconstruction of their specific memories. So this sort of reconstruction nature of memory is pointing to the example of the Bartlett studies. So the Bartlett studies, specifically for Bartlett, he advanced the concept that memories of past events and experiences are actually mental reconstructions that are colored by cultural attitudes, personal habits, rather than being a direct recollection of your memories and observations made at that time. So these experiments and these studies began in 1914. He showed that very little of an event is actually perceived at the time of the recollection or occurrence, but that in that reconstructing of the memory, gaps in observations and perceptions are filled in with the aid of previous experiences. So this kind of speaks to suggestibility in those 7 sins of memory, of how say for instance 20 years ago something happened to you, and you perceive that occurrence to be something that you remember. However, with the lapse in the time and the gaps in the reconstruction of that memory, your observations and your perceptions can be filled in with previous experiences, so that recollection or recalling of that memory may be altered slightly because of your other experiences that you have experienced after this occurrence, which is an interesting component. slides? I was gonna say it didn't seem like it, but I heard a little noise to where. Okay, so Bransford and Johnson. Do I want to spend a lot of time on this? Let's see how much more slides. We have so much more to discuss, so I won't spend too much time on this. Because I already spent so much time on the other slides. So you guys will read about Bransford and Johnson and their procedure. So let's talk about schematas, and scripts. So what are schemas? I know you've heard that word before. And what do these factors contribute to memory inaccuracy and memory errors? So schemas are a general knowledge structure for an event or situation. So they give an example, the idea of a dog. Scripts are they provide a general structure for a familiar event. They involve an ordered set of action that someone holds in their memory for that event. So they give an example of going food shopping. So these are processes that happen when we are talking about memory. So memory errors in the laboratory, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Eyewitness memory studies. And we talked a little bit about how in the beginning Jennifer Thompson and Ronald Cotton, and how that eyewitness testimony suffered from memory errors. So we'll talk a little bit more about it. The most real-world application of knowledge for memory errors is for Loftus and Palmer. It's so hard for me to say that. I don't know. Some words are just so difficult, so I'm sorry. So in this scenario, it was a study between, so specifically, it was a reconstruction of an automobile accident. And they wanted to determine whether people thought the automobile was smashed versus was it a hit. So basically it was a study between interaction between language and memory, and how that varies and differs for each person. And ultimately it suffered from the misinformation effects. A lot of the witnesses were vulnerable to misinformation when they were exposed to incorrect post-event information. So like I said, the whole goal was to examine memory and eyewitness testimony specifically. So it was an interesting study that was done, and if you want to read a little bit more about that, you can do so. I'm sure they have so many YouTube videos or even articles that you can read. If you just Google Loftus and Palmer 1974, some great information will pop up. So let's move on. Next slide. Okay, so also too, when discussing Jennifer Thompson and the eyewitness or memory error, there's a couple things that now practices and procedures that police officers and law enforcement do to prevent or reduce false identification from eyewitness testimony. So, and specifically to reduce memory error. So ask yourself this: how can we make eyewitness memory errors less likely, in specific in the cases of people that are falsely convicted? Do we change the way eyewitnesses are questioned? Do we change lineup procedures, including a double-blind procedure? So the suspect and the victim are both blind to who each other are. Presenting one suspect at a time instead of all at once, could that be an effective measure? Letting the identifier know that the suspect may not be in a lineup, that is also a great way to do that. Also, not providing any bias in terms of, unsolicited IQs or things like that from law enforcement or other people that may be in the room. And I think that was a major issue within the case of Jennifer Thompson and Mr. Colt Cotton. Um, Law enforcement was, yes, she was sure, and she was um, going off her memory, but there's a lot of cues and things like that going on. So that's important to consider. Using cognitive interviews instead of typical police questioning. So which ones do you think would be an effective way to enhance and to reduce memory errors? So on the topic of memory errors, that along comes, of course, amnesia, and the different types of amnesia. And some of you may have experienced this, some of you may have not, but of course, amnesia is the loss of memory. So, of course, there's retrograde amnesia and anti-retrograde amnesia. But I'm trying to see if there's anything else I want to talk to you about in terms of amnesia, because I think you guys get the gist of it. Of course, the one thing I do want to talk to you about amnesia is this patient HM, which is an interesting case. He was known by a lot of psychology students as HM because he lost his memory on an operating table in the hospital in Hartford in 1953. He was 27 years old, and he suffered from epileptic seizures for many years, so he had epilepsy. And Henry's memory loss was, of course, it wasn't a simple thing, considering he did experience chronic seizures. Not only could he make no conscious memories after his operation, he also suffered from retrograde memory loss. And what they ended up doing was they removed his hippocampus. And he had a lot retrograde memory loss, which was a lot of memories prior to his brain damage were lost. And for an 11-year period before surgery, it is not clear why this happened, although it is also thought that it's not because of his the loss of his hippocampus on both sides of the brain. But I think that the study did pinpoint that maybe the chronic seizures and epilepsy did some damage to his hippocampus and contribute to a lot of his memory loss. And it was also, why I'm so confused why this never, okay. So where was I? So they contributed that it was more likely it was a combination of him being on large doses of anti-epileptic drugs, and his frequent seizures prior to his surgery that contributed to his memory loss. His global amnesia for new material was the result of the loss of both his hippocampi, and that meant that he was unable to, learn new words, songs, faces, or anything after his surgery. And he also forgot who he was talking to as soon as he turned away. He didn't know how old he was or if his parents were alive or dead, and he would never, ever clearly remember an event such as his birthday or any parties, who the current president was, and he ultimately lost the ability to retain and learn new motor skills, such as becoming, faster at drawing a path through a picture of a maze. So those little maze puzzles that we did as kids, he was unable to do. He was unable to use any maybe like crutches or things like that whenever he hurt himself. So yeah, there was so much that he lost because of him losing his hippocampus after it was removed, and they figured that would help with his amnesia, and it ultimately made it worse. He had no conscious memory that he had ever seen or done before at all. So that was one of the worst case scenarios in terms of amnesia and memory loss. So, of course, we talked about types of amnesia, retrograde and anti-retrograde. And here's a little diagram to help you remember which one is which I think is helpful because I think many of us get those mixed up, which one's which. Let's see. Alzheimer's disease, and this is a big topic of discussion in terms of memory loss and memory error. So of course, Alzheimer's disease, it's one of the more common causes of progressive amnesia. It occurs when neuron function is disrupted by plaques and tangles, and appears to begin with hippocampal deterioration. The incidence is expected to rise with an increased aging population, so the older adult community, and mild cognitive impairment is often a precursor. So those are warning signs to this may be occurring. And there's so many studies of trying to figure out what to do to prevent Alzheimer's from occurring, whether that's exercise, diet, but I don't think they pinpointed exactly what can help us. So Alzheimer's, of course, the plaques are bundles of beta and myeloid protein that develop in the space between neurons, known as the synapse. And we learned about that previously. Disrupts communication between neurons, so that's what aids the forgetfulness and the memory loss portion. So the disruption between the communication between neurons is what causes it. Entangles, and then it's the tau and myeloid protein fibers that develop in a neuron's nucleus. Here's a picture of a healthy brain versus a brain with Alzheimer's, so you can get an idea of what the plaques and tangles are. So you can see here the gaps. There's not many I want to say my myeloid protein in between here. You can see it's deteriorating. Yeah, so sad. Okay, and lastly, last slide. I know I talked so much on this presentation. So amnesia in childhood. So there is, of course, whenever you're a child, sometimes amnesia does occur, and whether that's from a traumatic brain injury or just forgetfulness and things like that. So infantile and childhood amnesia, which is a lack of memory of one's life before the age of 5. And many of us have this. I think that I can't even remember what I was doing whenever I was 5, 4, let alone 3 or 2. And it just happens. It's the part of our brains not being fully developed and things like that. So that happens. And it's not necessarily a complete lack of memory for this time period. It's just hard to recall that information. And sometimes people can only remember a few things. Typically it affects episodic memories and not semantic or implicit memories. So specific, I guess, time frames or incidents that happen. But there's one thing I wanted to talk to you guys about. There was and this speaks to how memory and experience affect and shape us as adults. There was this, I went to this conference, and this guy was speaking, and he talked about how he was deathly afraid to fly. So he had to fly into this conference, and he ultimately overcame his fear of flying. But for a very long time, whenever he would get on the plane, he would it would feel like he was choking and he couldn't breathe. And so he was always deathly afraid to fly. So whenever he went home for a trip, and of course it was a big thing, he had to take some medicine to calm him down and things like that. But when he got home, he was talking to his parents of how deathly afraid he was of flying and how difficult it was, and he felt like he was choking. And his parents started talking about a time when he was a little boy. I want to say he was probably maybe 3 or 4. And whenever he was on the plane, he was eating peanuts or popcorn or something, and he started choking on the popcorn. And it was a big deal, and all the flight attendants were coming to help him, and eventually, of course, he was able to get the popcorn out of his throat. But from that experience, that shaped his older adult life, and how he felt whenever he was on a plane. So that little experience of him as a child choking on popcorn affected him as an adult, and ultimately he met with a therapist to get over his fear of flying. And of course, he had children, so he wanted to be able to be okay on a plane whenever he was flying with his children. But I just think that it speaks to how our memories and our experience as a child affect us as an adult. And he had amnesia about the event, of course, but his subconscious remembered that, and that's what triggered his responses to flying. So yeah, just take that little note and just think about like any experience or thing that you may have experienced as a child that may have affected how you are today as an adult. But yeah, with that being said, I think that's all I'm going to discuss for this week. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. I know this video was a little bit longer than I was planning on it, but it had some great information, and I think you guys will find it very valuable and useful. So yeah, that is all. I hope you have a great week, and I hope you guys stay safe. Have a good one.